Okay, so welcome everyone to Paving the Way to a Culture of Consent. This is designed to be a next level look at consent in our culture and how we can participate in being part of those changes we want to see. Beyond yes means yes. They reached out to us, Three Cranes, to present because of other work that we have done around this in the community. So thank you for the opportunity for us to share some of the information that we found. There's so much more to be explored that please don't take this as the be all end all of the topics. This is an introduction to the next level of things, and there's tons of links and resources and bibliography. I just posted the glossary of terms in a PDF to the chat in case we say a word that you are not very familiar with. And it's also going to be in the PowerPoint, which Mike will send out after the event. My name is Reverend Missy Ashton, and this is my husband, Reverend William Ashton. We are from Mountain Ancestors Grove in Colorado, and we've been here for 5.5 years.
Yeah, getting on 6 years as a fully chartered grove.
Yep. Yeah, so a couple housekeeping notes. One, this is not a presentation for children. There are a lot of adult themes to be discussed here, so if you have little ones, please use your own discretion to decide how to parent your children. Also, if you've ever done any work along the lines of recognizing privilege and dominance hierarchy and those types of things, sometimes there are feelings that arise when you hear an explanation of an unconscious habit that you had that turns out to be less than positive. So as you have those emotions arise, just sit with those, because that usually means that there's something there for you to explore. And we're not saying to take what we say as rote law, but to take these points as places for you to explore your own path in developing and being part of a consent-based culture. So we will share our screen now, and we have this lovely PowerPoint for you. Ta-da.
Okay, is it happening? Is the screen actually being shared? Oh, right on. Okay. Outstanding.
Oh, so we're not seeing it. We're only seeing us. That's cool.
Well, I can. Sorry, y'all.
No, it's fine.
Oh dear.
So we'll just have to watch over here. Okay. We're used to using WebEx, so we're still getting used to how Zoom looks when you're sharing your screen. So thank you for our.
We appreciate your patience.
Minute to look at tech. Okay. So paving the way to a culture of consent. As we said, their glossary of terms is available for you. They are not the only definitions for each of these words, but they are the definitions that most closely relates to the topic. Okay, so because not everyone has had a formal class on consent, we did want to offer an introduction to the idea of consent. So we're going to start with the yes means yes part of this and then expand from there. Consent is more than permission. It's not just asking a question and getting a yes or no. It has to do with creating an agreement with somebody. It's voluntary. Someone is not obligated to consent to something. That's the opposite of consent. Consent is mutual. Both parties have to agree. It's not that one person agrees and the other person says, okay. Consent is mutual. And consent can be withdrawn at any time. That is an important thing to note because people need to have the agency to change their minds at any time.
And we'll talk about that later.
Yep. Past consent does not denote current consent. Just because someone said yes in the past does not mean that they are obligated to continue to do so in the future. There is no consent where there is force, intimidation, or coercion. If you have to talk someone into it, you don't have real consent. There is no consent if a person is mentally or physically incapacitated or impaired. If someone is drunk, they are not actually giving you consent. If someone cannot understand the fact, nature, or extent of the situation, If they don't understand what you're asking, you didn't get real consent. So that is basically the crux of the yes means yes commentary.
Right. It's what we've been calling around here a pamphlet level understanding of consent. It's very topical. It's very basic. It's so much of it overlaps with a lot of standard American social customs-ish that you can kind of get on board with some of the language. Now as we take it into second gear.
Consent needs to be clear and enthusiastic, which means that there's a layer of good communication skills that is involved. You have to be clear with what it is that you're asking from folks so that they understand, not so that you understand what you're asking, but so they understand what you're asking. And it's more than no means no and yes means yes. Anything less than yes, spoken in a confident and enthusiastic way, is no. Silence is no. And we'll talk about the I in imagination and interpreting consent in a bit. This is going to be fun.
Right.
Also, consent is very specific. It needs to be sober, but it can also be fun. You know, if you are a wordsmith, learn how to play with your words to make it less awkward. It's hard when you first start getting used to asking for consent, but if you make that, if you normalize it and just make it part of the way that you move through the world and talk to people, it makes it a lot easier to just normalize it.
Let me just interject on the other side of that coin. There is the weaponizing of that particular skill and using words for manipulative purposes. So just be very mindful of who you're privileging in that interaction. Is it you and your own needs, or is it the other person and their needs? So.
And no isn't personal. When
Right.
someone says no, it's not about you. It's because they don't want to. It's not, I don't want to because I don't like you. It's, I don't want to because I don't want to. So we also need to be careful that we don't project our own feelings onto someone else as an intention.
And to be quite frank, even if it is, no, I don't like you.
Well, that needs to be okay.
That too is okay, because if no means no, and the reason why it's no is because I just don't like you because of your character, that too is okay. Yeah,
That's true.
It has to be, yeah.
This is also one of my favorite graphics. This is a Planned Parenthood graphic, and it's the Fry's model of consent. Consent is freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And it's an easy way to kind of remember just when you're starting to frame your questions, because this, when we're talking about more than sex, this gets tricky to try to figure out how to play with these words.
Right.
Consent in action. How do you know when someone wants to have sex with you? You ask them.
Pretty straightforward.
There's no other way around that. If they didn't say, yes, I'd like to have sex with you, then the answer is no, up until that point. Clarity seeking is an important part of confirming assumptions. Respectfully receive a no when someone gives that to you, because it's not just about sex. This is about our relationships in general, the way that we relate to one another. It's very difficult to be in right relationship with someone when you cannot refuse them something.
Yeah, you can't refuse a request or an ask, then.
Yes. Consent is about culture, and culture is how we move through the world and how the world moves through us. One of the best places to look at models for consent is to search through some of the bylaws and resource material from the kink community. A lot of folks have very strict,
the poly community as well. Yeah,
and the poly community and alternative lifestyles. They have a lot of really good source material for creating boundaries and for checking for confirmation and for getting consent for things. Being clear about the things that people are asking. So I definitely would suggest looking through some of those if you're looking for some ideas.
So at this point, we're going to put it open just for a couple moments for questions. We're not looking for personal experiences and shared stories at this point. We're looking for questions on the material that we have presented thus far.
Okay, good. I was hoping there wouldn't be a ton of questions about that because that's the straightforward part.
Okay, outstanding.
Awesome, thank you. And if you think of something later, go ahead and drop it in the chat or let us know. So consent at every age. So we're moving past the I'm an adult and I'm talking about consent in that little tiny box that is sexual interaction.
Right, we're talking about now the shifting from consent as an idea between adults for adult things to now how do we see consent, how do we enculture consent in the people around us, in our families, in our church communities, in our school communities. How do we create and craft very consciously a culture of consent? So we start at the beginning.
Early in life, little kids learn consent-based practices through vocabulary words and modeling. Teach them words like body, space, and touch. Teach them about respect and how to receive no from a very young age. It's easy for kids to understand ideas about emotional intelligence because they're very in touch with their feelings at that age. They're very driven by how they feel. This makes me angry. I don't want to do that. You can't, whatever. This makes me so happy. This is my favorite. All of those things are because they are steeped in their emotions. And that's one of the beautiful things about childhood. And we can use that skill set that they have and foster it as a strength so that they can build their own agency. But that also means that we have to model the way that we want them to move through the world. When they say no, then we need to respect that in a way that doesn't destroy them. Now it's hard because there are times where you need to have your kids obey you. And when they say no, that's a problem. So finding that balance between giving them agency, but having them understand that they need to follow instructions is very difficult. And the line moves all the time.
Right.
It's not easy.
When you get outside, honestly, we're talking like early childhood here, outside of ideas and concepts like body, space, touch, respect. These are things that young kids could appreciate. These are things that they can kind of get behind. Mm-hmm. These are ideas that they at that level can actually process. When we start getting into like emotional intelligence, it's kind of like really difficult to have a conversation about emotional intelligence and agency with like a 4-year-old.
Right.
You can have 4-year-old types of conversations about that, but really we're just trying to like plant seeds for those ideas. That's really what we're doing.
And they do understand things like mommy doesn't want to hug right now.
Mm-hmm.
They do understand things like it's time for us to sit down and be quiet right now. So I know you don't want to do this, but mommy has a headache, so we need to have quiet time. And just use your words to explain why you are making requests, because that helps them to understand and wants to comply more often than not. It's hard because sometimes kids are just in a mood, and I get it, I've got 3. But we begin teaching boundaries to kids by modeling boundaries with them. So this was a really difficult section for me because I had a lot of really quote unquote bad parenting habits that were passed down to me from generations of other parenting habits that we probably all have engaged in at some point. But there's a lot of room for us to improve modeling consent with kids, whether they're our own children or our nieces and nephews and grandkids, or the kids that come to our groves. So as a parent, do you make your children hug their relatives? Give grandma a hug. I don't want to. Grandma needs a hug from you. Give grandma a hug. That is something that a lot of us have done. My youngest son's autistic, and one of the ways that they teach autistic kids to quote unquote be normal is to push them into a patriarchal hierarchy of behaviors. And it took me a long time to realize that I needed it to be okay in my head for him to just be different and to not want hugs and to not want to be touched. A lot of times now I get an air 5. He doesn't touch me at all because he doesn't want to. And that's a boundary of his that it took me longer than I want to admit to recognize and respect. But now that I know better, I'm trying to do better. Do you make them attend birthday parties or open presents in front of their guests at their own party if they don't want to? They're their gifts. Well, you have to open these right now and pretend that you like it because you're going to hurt grandma's feelings. Is that something that we're teaching them? Because now we're teaching them that someone else's feelings are more important than their own.
And to be deceptive.
Yeah. Do you give them a choice between two options? One that's what you want them to do, and one that is obviously not what they're going to pick. And the ultimatum.
Do you clean your room, or would you like to go dig a ditch in 95-degree heat?
Fine, I'll pick the other option because that one's stupid.
Right. You want to do your homework or get your Xbox put into the shredder?
Do you want to eat this? Do you want to eat this broccoli, or do you want to go to bed hungry?
Right.
Well, if your kid is starving, they're not. They may either pick the broccoli or go to bed hungry, which is a whole separate issue.
We just need to be mindful when we're making those agreements with our children that they're healthy agreements.
And if you've done any of these things, don't feel bad.
Yeah, please.
Like, these are the types of things that have been modeled for us for generations. And it doesn't make us bad parents. It makes us parents who were following the modeling that was given to us. But now that we know better, we have room to have our kids treat their kids differently. Mm-hmm. So if you've ever done any of these things, or you can remember a bad experience, it might be useful to talk to your older kid and say, do you remember that time I made you hug your grandma even though you didn't want to? Well, mommy was wrong, and I'm sorry. You get to choose who touches your body and not anyone else. And from now on, I will make sure we ask you if you want a hug, and you won't be in trouble if you say no. Because they need to have space. They need to have safe space to say no. And that's something that's important for us to teach them. So this slide is a link, a series of links to books, and you'll get this PowerPoint so you can use these. These are some books that I found that were really useful for little kids up through elementary school. So you can go ahead and look through those. Teaching consent to tweens and teens is when it gets weird. Because this is when body parts start becoming more apparent and more important or more distracting to them.
Science chemicals.
Missy, can I ask a question before you go on?
Yeah.
So about the kids thing, like, where's the line about teaching kids to be kind, for example? Like, I can get the touching thing, but say, like, someone was kind to give them a gift or something like that, and they don't want to open it, but you want them to open it because it's like a kindness in return. Sure. Because that's the pleasure that the gift giver gets. Like, if you never kind of make them do that, will they never like understand like the kindness that like see the sort of the quality of kindness that can be done from doing something for somebody else if you don't make them do it at some level. If you get my
For sure. Well, I think that depends on where your kid's at and the kind of conversations that you have with your kids as a parent, honestly. If that is a conversation that you can have with your kids about kindness and about considering others, then that's something that they will ultimately have to weigh. I think, Wayne, I think ultimately we shouldn't force them into these decisions whether because we think it's right. Unpacking that for them and having those discussions as a parent, I think, is very crucial. Mm-hmm. But I think that's going to play out differently every time it comes up. And I'm sure a lot of the parents can nod along to this.
And those are great opportunities to have a conversation with your kiddo and say, when people bring you a gift, they really like to see you open it so they can see how much you like it. Right. And so there's this whole nuanced conversation to have with your kids about the way that they receive gifts and how they communicate if they don't like something. But because gratitude and their personal feelings are different things. They can express gratitude without having to say, oh my God, I love this. Thank you. That was very kind. What a thoughtful thing. I'm so glad that I was important enough for you to think of me in this time. And that's why modeling is important. They watch us. The mirror neurons in kids are so strong. They watch everything we do, whether we want them to or not.
Right.
They're the kid. They'll repeat every little tiny snippet of conversation you didn't think they were listening to at the most inopportune time.
It is known.
So they watch you. They watch you a lot. They learn how to move through the world by watching how you move through the world. So if you want your kids to be kind and to understand how to be a gracious receiver and a good guest and just to express gratitude and kindness to people, then that's how you need to move through the world and model that to them.
Just like consent.
We have so much power in our kids' lives that we take for granted. And we can create beautiful space for them to grow up to be wonderful humans by teaching ourselves to be better humans and showing them and taking the opportunities to explain to them why we make the decisions that we do. A lot of the time, we don't talk to our little kids about these types of things. We don't say anything to them at all. They're little people who are running around the room, and we may be having interactions with other people around us and completely ignore them, but they're still watching the way we interact with people. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a ton of folks who have a background in child psychology who could explain and talk about that more.
You could reach out to them at the end of this presentation.
Yep. That's a good question. Thank you, Wayne. So tweens and teens. Yeah, puberty was not fun at my house. But this is the point where you can start introducing the next set of vocabulary words. You know, as they start exploring romantic situations. And you can include things like sexual harassment and coercion as those conversations progress. Each kid is ready for these types of conversations at a different time. There's no specific age when you want to start introducing specific concepts. One of the things that is recommended is for you to listen to the types of questions they're asking you and let that help guide you toward what they're ready to hear. And ask them a lot of questions and let them talk. Sometimes they just need to talk through it so they can come to some sort of final understanding, or at least grasp a concept. These kinds of discussions are going to blend into other parts of their lives, not just sex. There's a lot going on at this age. Discussions should include alcohol and controlled substances and getting into cars with people who aren't necessarily in the right shape or have permission to drive. Create space for them to talk. Woo!
Okay.
All right, that was fun. Because consent is not an issue specific to straight young men. We oftentimes will hear or read resources that put consent in the hands of our young men because they're responsible for making sure that they don't do shitty things. Well, there's a lot more to it than that.
And because there's a multiplicity of truth, many things can be true at the same time. Because of the social power dynamic in a lot of places in the world, specifically in the United States, it's very easy for straight young men to utterly abuse the power that they've been inherently given in the system. Mm-hmm. So that too is a part of the discussion with teens and teens that needs to come into place.
And we need to remind our non-male identifying children that they get to keep their agency as they grow. As they're introduced to the different parts of the patriarchal society that we live in, it becomes more difficult for our young ladies and our non-male children to say no to those types of things. So the two parts of the coin for kids at this age is that no means no. Our society teaches our young men that
don't take no for an answer.
Don't take no for an answer. And if she's of high moral quality, then she's gonna have to say no the first time. So keep asking.
Oh, dearie me, no.
And it also tells our young men that if a woman asks them, and I understand I'm talking in a lot of binary terms, a lot of our social hierarchy rules are built on the social construct of gender, which is unfortunate.
Right.
But these are what we're discussing right now are the things we're up against.
Right. This is the super culture of which we're trying to combat here. No
means no doesn't mean someone needs more convincing. It also means that when you mean no, say no. And if someone asks you a second time, tell them no again.
Maybe. Let me think about it.
That means no.
What you want to say is no.
Right.
More often than not.
Right.
But if you do want to think about it, that just opens up another opportunity to have more conversation around this consent moment.
Yep. Because peer pressure for behaviors is a breach of consent. That includes, I want you to come to the mall with me. I want to go to this party with so-and-so that I like that's at so-and-so's house, but you don't, like there are so many different scenarios where someone might want to say no to something.
Right.
So, oh, come on, please, I don't want to go by myself. Well, I don't want to go, and that needs to be okay. And there's so much relationship dynamic there to be unpacked there, because teenagers are hard. So here's a couple of links for specifically older kids. It's the T video. Everyone loves the T video. It's your favorite. The T video is great for middle school kids because it really helps them to understand the abstract concept in an adult world that they're trying to enter into. And then the teaching consent doesn't have to be hard is another link for you guys to have. Some of the additional things that kids have to deal with in high school. So cancel culture may be something that you have seen referenced. It's also called call out culture, and it's a form of boycott that usually happens in a social media setting. This is actually happening in high schools. I work in healthcare, and there's a lot of evidence about how peer pressure and peer relationships feed into teen suicide attempt rates and those types of really negative impacts that the teenage lifestyle can have on kiddos. It's often used in social justice circles to try to shame people into a desired behavior. In high school students, it's usually a means of retaliation, either for giving in to peer pressure. Other terms for that are like slut shaming, which is a whole separate problem, or for not giving in. And the social consequences can be very damaging. When someone is canceling you, they are actively speaking against you to get other people to also boycott you, essentially.
Right.
And we do. Kids are mean. They shun people. Canceling is a sign of emotional immaturity, and it's something that a lot of teenagers are still working to develop.
Before we go on to the next thing, having discussions with your teen and tween around cancel culture as it's happening, as they see it happening around them, as perhaps it's happening to them. Having been the step parent to teenage kiddos, I had no idea of the level that this was going on. It is shocking with the amount of media access and everything else that our kids have. Parents really need to step up. Especially religious parents, because what cancel culture doesn't leave an opportunity for is grace. There's not an opportunity for re-engaging someone when they don't do these things, or having that second level of discussion. It privileges the experience of self, an egoic experience, and then sets people off on one another. It allows people to attack one another. Mm-hmm. It's terrible. There's no room for grace, which is a huge opportunity as a parent to talk about that with your kid.
Yep. And one of the other issues that kids often experience is the concept of ghosting. Ghosting is similar to canceling, only in ghosting, you no longer exist and they don't talk to you anymore. Usually, this is more common among girls because they run in circles, groups, very tight groups. And if one of them is all of a sudden on the outs, everyone else just disappears and that person no longer exists to them. No one replies to their texts, no one replies to their emails, no one answers their phone. They completely ignore them as though they don't exist in the hallways at school, and it's very socially isolating. Ghosting is the social media equivalent of the silent treatment. Canceling and ghosting behaviors are signs of emotional immaturity, as I said before. But teaching consent as an alternative can make a big difference in the emotional health and well-being of our teens. Gosh, there's so much. I'm looking at the clock like, how much time do I have? These are the types of social behaviors that we probably instill in them without realizing it. How many of you have ever said, I'm not shopping at Walmart, or have shamed someone who's shopped at Walmart because the Koch brothers, God damn it, blah, 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 whatever. You know, or well, I can't buy a whatever kind of car because whatever reasons. Or, well, I don't want to go talk to so-and-so because they're friends with so-and-so who belongs to this social group that I'm not okay with. Like we feed into this behavior in ways that we think is justified from a social justice standpoint that feeds them to continue these kinds of behaviors on their own. This is a very nuanced conversation, and this is something that I actually want to explore more myself because I'm still learning. Because my kids are old. I'm old, my kids are old, and watching them go through their teenage years has been difficult for me because I'm realizing how many bad habits I have that I'm now seeing manifest in my children. Yeah, and I think that the important thing is the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And our society has taught our young people that when something isn't up to our standards, we just completely pretend it doesn't exist.
Or we hate on it. Which is a separate issue.
We'll talk about language in a minute. It's fine. All right, so now your kid is hitting like 18 and they're starting to learn how to become an adult, which some of us aren't very good at yet. And some of our young people might be going off to college and moving away from the house. So now we're looking at our young adults who don't live with us anymore, or who are at a point where they're making their own decisions, setting their own schedules, and we're not telling them what to do. How do we talk to them? How do we talk to our young adults to help them understand some of the things that they're going to encounter that we have protected them from, or shielded them from, or helped them work through when we're not around?
Going out into the unprotected world where there's no buffers, like it's like when you leave the dojo, when you actually get in a real fight, there's no pads and buffers all around you. So when your kiddos are out in that world, they're going to be exposed to not at home language, or not at the chosen school that your kids are going to language, or whatever else. They're going to be around a language that is, for example, the phrase rape culture in and of itself. We see the second one down, like how we talk to people matters. The language we use, when we start to unpack just that term rape culture as the opposite of consent culture, when we look at it, rape, anytime that anyone is examining what this is about, it's about this idea of dominance. It's about power, because it's not always about sex. And to equate it as rape culture tends to put it directly into this sexual frame, which closes off a lot of conversations with simpler-minded people who don't necessarily want to speak in metaphor to you and want to be problematic. So the more inclusive and open you could be in that language, these are shifts that young adults can start to make, like in that how we talk to people about things. And by this time, all this has been modeled, right? This has been modeled through their church group experiences. If we're hanging out with the right churches, God's be good. This has been modeled at home. This has been modeled through hanging out with the right friends and relatives, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it's how we approach these conversations now. Because now their agency has grown, their knowledge pool has grown, their experiences have grown, they're philosophizing. I remember 18-year-old, my eldest stepchild at 18, he was quite the philosopher, as it were, and still is, especially, he was quite the philosopher when he didn't want to do something. So anyway.
Yeah, rape culture is, it's what, just like beyond yes means yes, when we limit our discussion to specifically rape culture, we're talking about sex, and there's so much more involved in the dominance culture that we have in our society. This includes things like colonialism and imperialism, our patriarchal models that we have built, the gender dynamics that we have, the racial dynamics that we have. Dominance culture feeds into so many more layers because a lot of our young people are not sexually aggressive. Like I know a lot of people with kids, and a lot of those kids are lovely people, and I can't imagine any of them doing anything like this. And some of those kids have the same tendencies that exist in our dominance culture world, where bullying is a problem. They don't know how to assert themselves. They don't necessarily have the right agency. They follow societal models. Well, I had to because, and there's a layer of conversations, and teaching them how to recognize power differentials at a young age will help them to keep themselves in better circumstances as they're moving on to do things by themselves when we're not with them. So this is a list of some of the questions that arise when we are considering dominance culture and dismantling those systems. This is a tangent to the rest of this presentation, but I wanted to put this slide in here for you so that if you want to explore this more, and if you have kids that are of this age, talk through some of these questions with them to help them just kind of see where they sit with this and see what their ideas are. These may be words or things they've never even thought of. And hearing this from us rather than waiting until a bad thing happens to them and then learning from that experience will help to empower them and to help them continue to build their own agency as they move through the world. So how do we talk about this with our kids? How do we let people know? How do they let people know when their boundaries are crossed? Like, there's so many questions, and we need to find actionable suggestions for how to move through this. So this is a great resource, and I'm going to let William talk about this because.
Yeah, total shout out to this. I was turned on to the Unitarian Universalist OWL program our whole lives. This thing is amazing. If you know people in the UU, if you have access to a UU group, donate some money to them or some services if y'all can make trade. Study these things. This literally is about from kindergarten through high school and beyond. And it's each level and how it relates specifically to their particular values and their particular the things that they treasure in their religion, the things that they look to for their sources, and how those things support this idea of consent, of knowing yourself. Like this is a growth and discovery class that UU offers for their kiddos in all sorts of different congregations. I'm sure that I know Shawneen is connected to UU and can probably answer a ton of these questions. Ping him, haha, Shawneen, sorry. He'll help out the Cranes and get y'all tuned in to the OWL program. If you want to read more about it, the UUs, bless them, they're such generous beings. The whole OWL program is pretty much online. So check it out, honestly. Consent is woven throughout the thing, like the core color of a tapestry. Like, it's obvious how much consent is just built into this identity, sexuality exploration, like at every age, like age-appropriate things as it goes on. So if we're looking for how to model this, specifically in a setting for religious groups, large or small, outstanding way to it's just an outstanding resource. So
I wish I had found it when my kids were small.
Seriously. True story.
So if you're like me and you have older kids, you're now asking yourself, what if I haven't done any of this with my kids?
Repent. Oh, sorry.
No. No, now is the best time to start. Ask them questions and see what they already know. Ask them about the words and concepts and see what they say. It's going to be awkward until it isn't, and then something will happen and it'll be awkward again. And it's just, talking about this stuff is weird. It can be weird, especially if you've never had these types of conversations with your kiddos.
And that's okay.
And that's okay. Like, letting things feel awkward and not trying to make it not awkward or to hide that it's awkward is not going to help. That's not good modeling.
It's like doing most things that you feel in your body, right? Because you feel this discomfort usually in your body. It's not like you're thinking about discomfort and it's like, oh, these discomforting thoughts. Usually you have some kind of somatic experience to this discomfort. And just like anything, training in yoga or martial arts or any sort of body practice, you're going to be uncomfortable doing it for a bit. But if you train yourself to get through that, you will eventually become stronger.
Mm-hmm. Your body's trying to tell you something. Right. If something feels awkward, if you have some sort of feeling, look at that and try to see if you can figure out why. Because when your body's, if we teach our kids to ignore those feelings, if we ignore the awkwardness, if we ignore those little butterfly feelings, then we may ignore warnings or other types of information. Our bodies are energetic and they can feel things around us oftentimes before we mentally understand them. And it's important for us to be able to foster and say things like, you know what, I have a bad feeling right now about whatever, or, you know what, this feels really awkward. I think I need to figure out how I feel, you know, and just be honest about how you feel and normalize having emotions. Any questions about that part?
About the kiddos section.
Awesome.
In 3.
All right.
2.
So let's take a closer look at consent behaviors, because we've talked a lot about modeling. So what can we do to model the type of behavior that we want to see? I'd like to start with a closer look at boundaries.
Yes, please.
Boundaries in relationships are about emotional health. Boundaries create emotional health, and emotionally healthy people create boundaries, which is all fine and good. And this is the general theme of everything that I found. Emotionally healthy people set boundaries. And I was surprised at how much I had to read through to find something actionable and useful.
Right. It's like the only thing you could find about houses is like people who don't get wet live in houses.
Yes.
How do I build one of these houses? It's rainy around.
So I was very disappointed at some of the lack of clear resources on boundaries. Mm-hmm. One thing that I found useful was this list of questions, because a lot of it, we're all adults. So it's really helpful for us to figure out if we have a boundary issue, which we might, and then try to get to the foundation of what that looks like. Boundaries.
Take a screenshot of this, y'all. These are like heavy questions that if you find yourself on the other side of boundaries and find yourself saying, goodness, how did I get here? Or find yourself being the person whose boundaries get continually walked over. These are questions to reflect upon. These are rich questions.
Yep. So this was helpful for me. And I got to tell you, this slide has I have a lot of feels about this slide.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a resource.
Mm-hmm.
Healthy personal boundaries are you taking responsibility for your own actions and emotions and not taking responsibility for the actions and emotions of others. Mm. How someone else feels is not your fault or problem. If you have made a mistake and you have ruptured something, part of taking responsibility is repairing that. And if someone else feels a certain way because you didn't whatever, because you had a boundary and you said no, how they feel about your no is not your problem.
That is correct.
Poor boundaries in romantic relationships are often a result of poor boundaries in our family relationships, because modeling comes to us from our parents and our grandparents and our aunts and uncles and our older siblings. And if they weren't good at boundaries, likely we aren't either. And that's okay, because now that we know better, we can do better. It doesn't mean that we're bad people. It means that this may be a blind spot that we had. Poor boundary setting is commonly associated with codependency and can lead to victim mentalities or avoidant behaviors. This is something that comes from a mental health resource that I wanted to put in here just as a point for consideration for folks who may be feeling a lot of emotions around this notion of boundaries. If you're feeling things right now, that's good. That means that this is a topic that's important and that we need to explore that. But the bottom line is that sacrificing for others, while noble, is not healthy. Coercion is a tool people use to get you to step over a boundary, and that needs to be something that's not okay. So how does one set boundaries? Setting boundaries takes courage, practice, and support. We have to give space for people to have boundaries. Goes back to the accepting a no.
Well, and having that cultural idea of how do we do this together? You know, how do we do this as a church community, or how do we do this as a religious community?
I don't know why there's a question mark on that slide.
I don't know either.
That's a typo.
Typo. Sorry.
Setting boundaries is hard. Part of setting boundaries is that we need to know where our own limits are. Tune into our own feelings. We need to name our limits to a point where we can actually be direct and state them. We need to be aware of how we feel, and because sometimes we don't know we need a boundary until we find ourselves in a situation where we're like, hey, there's probably a boundary here. Because you can feel yourself becoming uncomfortable. You can feel yourself starting to doubt what's happening around you. And you may not be able to put it into words just yet, but all of those emotions that arise, all of that awkwardness, all of those butterflies and that apprehension you feel, that's your body telling you to pay attention to what's happening right now, because something is making you uncomfortable. So seek support, be assertive, and start small. Make yourself a priority. And if you give in to somebody while you're trying to learn how to do this, get up and try it again.
It's not about how many times you fall. It's about how many times you get up.
When we first start trying to assert our boundaries, sometimes it's very difficult because we're not, some of us, I read this in one of the articles and it's so true. Some of us were not really good at saying no. And so when we first started trying to say no, it came out, no! And everyone's like, oh God, God, why are you being such a jerk? It's like, because it took so much energy and chutzpah for me to be able to get that no out, that it came out as this like gigantic, like, absolutely not. When I really just should have said, no, thank you. Because learning how to assert yourself when you have not been assertive is comical and sad, and it makes you want to cry and laugh all at the same time, because it's hard. Like changing your own behaviors, especially if these are the behaviors that came from your parents and your parents' parents. It's a difficult thing to set boundaries. And sometimes there's that one jerk who repeatedly violates your boundaries. So here is an article that I found useful. I do believe Joe Auerbach shared it on Facebook.
Thank you, Joe.
And I found it to be great. So highly recommend reading this. If anybody wants to talk privately about boundary setting and some of the hilarities of me trying to work through doing that, feel free to hit me up. Happy to chat. Boundaries are hard. And they're important, because learning how to set boundaries is the first step in making yourself a priority in your life and making sure that your self-care is a constant part of your decision making, which will help us to teach our kids to set better boundaries. All right, consent in language. So now things are going to get really
abstract.
No. Yes. So When is it okay to use sexually explicit terms, unconventional language, or slang words that other people might find offensive?
Not.
When you have the consent to do so. And what do we know about consent? You have to ask.
And it's specific.
And it's specific. If someone corrects you or asks you to stop using specific language, receive that with grace. You may be comfortable with words that other people aren't. That doesn't make you a bad person, that makes you different people. And if other people don't want you to use those words, the right thing to do is to stop using those words in front of them.
Not argue why it's okay to use those words, or why historically we see in the lore that this hero used these words, and therefore it gives me the right, religiously as it were, to use these words.
I'm trying to normalize whatever, and so now I'm going to use this word.
Taking it back.
I'm like, okay, but that's, if you're doing more harm than good by taking back a word, then you might want to examine that process.
Then it's your ego that you're working for and not the good of that word.
So let's talk about consent in practice. Would we go into someone else's house without their consent, even if it was to do something nice? Would you walk into someone's house to clean their kitchen? Just walk in. Would you eat someone else's food in the refrigerator in the break room at work? If you answered yes to that, then you're part of the problem. What about gifts? If someone gives you a gift, does it set up an obligation that will negatively affect your relationship if you don't use the gift as the giver intended?
Think about that one, gift givers. Hail the givers.
Oh, sorry, I thought you had more to say on that.
No,
Yeah.
I was just kind of punctuating where you were going with it.
Yeah, like giving someone a gift is kind of like giving offerings to the kindreds. When you give something, your hands are now empty so that you may receive something in return. And once that gift is gone, it's in the fire. And what happens to it is out of your hands. It's once you give it, it's literally out of your hands. And what those other folks do with that gift is not your concern anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It's given away. If there's a string attached to that gift that it requires someone else to do something, that was a non-consensual gift, and you put an obligation on that, and that is not a healthy way to be in relationship with somebody.
Technically, the person didn't receive it in the spirit in which it was being sold to them. So, deception.
So, how do you interpret consent? The answer is you don't. Interpreting is making stuff up. It's all about imagination. Imagination is about what you want instead of stepping out of your mind and engaging in others with what they want.
It's more important to be hospitable of spirit than it is to be right.
I imagine I hear consent. I imagine I hear consent when someone doesn't say no. Well, they didn't say no. Have you ever heard anybody say that? I imagine I hear consent when, what do you think?
Imagine I hear consent when, after the no, I cleverly convince them to see why it should have been a yes.
Try to convince them why they're wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine that's consent.
Yeah, that's coercion. That's not okay. Do you guys have any other examples of things where someone, either you have imagined you heard consent and it ended badly, or someone imagined that you consented and it ended badly, or what that looked like?
Not looking to unpack experiences. We're just looking for some kind of.
Just some other examples.
Yeah.
I think one of the ones that we see a lot of times, at least in our small group circles, is I imagine consent when they weren't at the meeting, but it was their idea, so they're going to do it.
Yep, voluntold because you weren't there. Yeah, that's a big one. Well, it was their idea, so they wouldn't have said it if they weren't willing to do it. That's not consent. That requires a question and an answer. So even if our intentions are good, we can still break boundaries and not have proper consent for things. And I think that was the point that we wanted to make with this slide. Any other questions for this part? Because we're about to get into some of the deep stuff.
Yeah. Do you think, like, from a consent culture perspective, like, there's ever any place for convincing someone of something? Because that seems to me like sometimes we want to convince people of something good, like maybe you shouldn't take that 12th drink and get in your car, or, you know, like they're going to do something harmful to themselves, and like convincing them through logical argumentation. And maybe you don't, if they're like, no, I'm going to get in that car, you're like, can we re-examine that again, that maybe you shouldn't get in that car? Like, it just seems like convincing has a place.
Consent culture does not mean letting people do whatever they want. It doesn't mean that we step out of the way when someone is doing something harmful to themselves or others, because they have a right to do whatever they want to do. You can weaponize consent. William, do you want to talk about weaponized virtue when we get to that part?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, put a pin in that, because we're actually going to talk about that in a minute. So that's a good point, Wayne. Thank you.
Yeah, no, probably.
Any other questions? All right, consent in our druidry.
A little more specific here.
Yeah, how does this affect us directly? Wait, click on
the thing.
Okay, pagan consent culture. Pagan and polytheist groups, we are a unique bunch, because a lot of us don't want to use the word church. We tend to have different ideas about what behaviors are acceptable at our events. We often view our services as very social occasions.
It's a cocktail party that someone made some prayers at.
And the inherent social nature of our events can lead to very different behavioral expectations on an individual level that can cause boundaries to be crossed a lot. Small group dynamics and things like that. This is one of the issues that lives in paganism, because we don't want to use the word church, and we don't want to consider what we do a professional service, so we don't incorporate professional, respectful behaviors into the way that we operate in church on the whole. Please don't take this as me saying that all pagans suck and we never do any of these things. These are some of the issues that we sometimes see because, sociologically speaking, we view our events as typically social.
And speaking of social, dating.
Yep. So church, whether or not we like the word, is not just about meeting people, and certainly not about potential love interests. Please don't come to church to find a date. Please don't come to church to find a date. You know, if you're lonely, offer that to the community and let the community gift you with fellowship. I mean, they are social events, but fellowship is about connecting not only with the kindreds, but with one another. And you can find ways to have your social needs met without assuming that you have to be dating somebody to be in right relationship with them in a way that is whole and healing.
It's about developing intimacy.
Yes, intimacy can be intellectual. It doesn't have to have anything to do with sex. We live in an unfortunate time where intimacy and sex are placed in the same category. And you can be in an emotionally intimate relationship with somebody that has nothing to do with sexual interaction or feelings at all. Intimacy is bred from vulnerability. It's from sharing personal information about yourself.
It's from authenticity.
We have very intimate, close friends in our lives who are not sexual partners in any way. And that is something that I think we need to focus more on as a community in general, is the separation of intimacy from sexual relationships, and how those relationships can help to fulfill you in ways that are satisfying and to help you feel connected to the group around you.
Right. just to interject here real quick, like the idea of this being uncomfortable. So terms like friend zone come up. It's like, well, this is where we experience some of that discomfort and have conversations that take more than 2 words of friend zone when you're starting to define what your intimacy is, and like when you're starting to become vulnerable, when you're starting to show that more authentic self.
Mm-hmm. So being your authentic you will draw to you what you need, and you will find people who are willing to enter into deeper relationship, more meaningful relationship, closer, more intimate relationship. So just let your expectations go and allow your relationships to evolve to their own natural endpoint. Am I saying that you'll never meet anybody at church that you fall in love with? I'd like to introduce you to my husband, William, that I met at church.
My lovely wife.
So it can happen. But when I met William, I was actually not looking for any, I had come off of 5 months ago, I had broken up with someone, and I was done. I wasn't going to date anybody because everybody was terrible. I hate people and getting a job.
We went to the annual gathering for our religious organization for religious purposes, exclusively, and we happened to crash into each other. Ain't that something? Yeah,
so it can happen, but it shouldn't be an expectation that you're going to find someone and fall in love. And if you're going to a religious event specifically to meet a date, you may want to reconsider your intentions. Virtues and values.
Speaking of intentions.
Yep. Our understanding of virtue does not make us virtuous. Just because we know what wisdom means, just because we know what consent means, doesn't mean that we are practicing them. Our actions, which include the way we are in relationships with others, are more important, and they're tied more to our values. I can understand consent, but if I don't value it, then I'm not going to adhere to it. Values and communication are part of making amends and learning how to be in a right relationship with people. So religious consent. Consent must be required, in all caps, required prior to any initiating or ordeal-based promotion. When I was initiated into the ADF program, Jan and Michael did a good job of explaining to me what was going to happen without telling me what was going to happen to make sure that they weren't going to cross any lines or boundaries that I had. And even with them asking me those questions prior to the initiation, it was still one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had. Giving away the secrets of the initiation prior to the event is not going to cheapen it if you learn how to communicate properly and get proper consent. Requiring intimate contact as a means of gatekeeping promotion in your path is quid pro quo. Words are hard.
Latin's weird.
Actually, if you were at work, you would go to jail for that. I have heard lots of horrible stories of women who were forced to sleep with their high priest in order to get their next circle. I bring this up not because it's an ADF issue, but because we have a lot of, the pagan community is small. We have a lot of friends who are in other circles. And if you hear or see about any of this happening, this needs to be something that we as people who are trying to build a different culture speak out against and point out and stop in our greater pagan community.
One of the other things about the pagan community, because it's so small, it tends to generate more of an intimate nature quicker, but that also means that it breeds over familiarity. There's been people who have come up at festivals and like clapped me on the back and addressed me as friend, and I'm like, I don't even think we're Facebook friends. I read like a paragraph of my work on the ADF site, and that idea of over familiarity, I think, creates fertile ground in which boundary crossing happens. So anyway.
If you are the type of person who is leading an initiation, it would be really useful for you to have a discussion with other people in the know about how you can ask, like how you can phrase those consent asks without giving too much away, so that the other person's experience can still be rich and full and wonderful, because it's possible. And now we get uncomfortable.
That's right. Here's the part of the show where we're really, really, really going to ask you again to save your questions and or comments till the end of this.
Consent and deity. Oh, so much. Where do you start? So
let's start with the 2x4.
Yeah, so dominance.
I never consent to get hit.
Dominance culture and pop culture norms, as well as mythological and UPG norms, are steeped with this idea of greater than and less than. And even in our relationship with deity, we have boundaries, we have agency, we have the ability to say no. It's very hard for me to stay silent sometimes when I hear the dialogue that some folks like to use when they're referring to their relationships. Words like, I had no choice, or Odin claimed me, there was nothing I could do. I was taken over in a trance. And I hear those types of things a lot. And I want to unpack this a bit more, because I think we have two issues. One is boundary issues, and one is just the language that we use. Uncontrolled ecstatic trance is something that can happen. So ecstatic trance, are we all familiar with the concept of ecstatic trance, where you go into a trance state? If not, we'll have to talk about that later. So when you are in an uncontrolled ecstatic trance, it is possible for you to be horsed by a deity. This is typically the mechanism for drawing down. The difference I want to point out here is that drawing down is consensual. You can invite deity to speak through you and to work through you. When a being takes over your consciousness without your consent, that is a breach in their relationship agreement. And if you don't have a relationship agreement, then there's so much more that we need to. This is something we need to have a whole separate discussion about.
Yeah, this is a whole cultural shift. Like, you want to talk
Yes.
about culture? This is a cultural change.
Because trans experience and the narratives we use to explain our relationships, it's heavily influenced by dominance culture. You know, a lot of people who use the clue by four terminology, what they mean is, I received a message that was so powerful that it just hit me. And a lot of times those types of deity experiences are healthy and strong, right, and are built from the relationship that you have with that being. But the words that we use to describe it make it sound like you completely had no choice and the deity is in charge of you. When I know a lot of people who use these words who have beautiful relationships that are respectful and consensual with deity, who does sometimes appear to them and give them amazing just revelations in those spaces. Mm-hmm. And I don't want us to continue to cheapen the religious experiences we have by using words that less than our role in that relationship, mm-hmm, if that makes sense. Because we have a choice in our relationships with humanity as well as with the spirits. And if you have a spirit that is not respecting your boundaries, then please reach out to some of the magical professionals in your life, because we need to have a discussion about that. There are things that you can do. So, relationshiping. Building right relationship. What does that look like?
So at ADF we have, I'm just going to speak for ADF, okay, y'all? I'm not speaking for anybody else, just ADF. We've kind of modeled a lot of our language around this oppositional relationship between orthodoxy right belief, right believing, and orthopraxy, right doing, right? And that's because we can't tell people what to believe, right? So you're not the boss of me. Oh, that's like the fourth pagan commandment is, thou art not the boss of me. Give me a slide. Okay, so just these two. So usually in ADF, what we see is orthopraxy. Orthopraxy is better because we're not asking you to believe anything. We're just asking you to do the right thing, right? So this is so oppositional that someone who's a poly-minded person, just speaking for myself here, I have a hard time anytime I see like any sort of binary coming at itself, and it just bothers me. So in the thinking about this, I'm like, well, what's missing here? Like, we have all the three thing. We love threes, right? ADF loves its threes. Druids love their threes.
Yes,
we do. That's right. We love three. How about you? So we have orthodoxy, which is like the right mind, thinking the right things, studying the right things, making the mind and the brain as proper as possible, right? And to have proper function of this tool. So we don't put garbage into it because we're just going to get garbage out. Mm-hmm. We have the right doing bits, okay? Right action, right body, right being in space. But we're leaving something out, and this is something that I've taught from the pulpit at Mountain Ancestors, and it's this idea of orthopathy, which is right feeling. There has to be some sort of heart content when we're talking about holistic decisions and holistic relationshiping. There has to be the right known thing to do and the right stuff and things to do, but there also has to be an emotional component to this. I mean, it's kind of like giving hospitality without kindness. Then it's kind of hollow. It's like, well, I did the right thing. It's like, does that make you feel better? Like, honest to goodness, like, does that really make you feel better? Like, I did the right thing. I checked off the box, and therefore, I am hospitable. Wow, hold on. We just talked about this earlier. Just because you know that there is a virtue of hospitality, and that you know that if you do this, then you can check the hospitality box, doesn't necessarily mean that you were of right mind in the middle of it. Or that you were of right heart and spirit while you were going through this. So I think when we're talking about relationshiping, that we have to address the being correct with ourselves equals right, read as right, that being correct with ourselves, our holistic selves, not only in mind and action, but also in our heart, emotion, and feeling regarding these things.
Do you want to say more about weaponized virtue?
Oh, another specific teaching that we have here is each virtue is like the apex of a point of balance, and hanging off of it are three things. One is the lack of that virtue. So if we talk about hospitality, then we have miserliness on one of those things. On one of the other arms, we have the idiot version of the virtue. That's just what we call it around here. And it's taken from, that specific language is taken from the person who founded my university, Naropa University, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. He would use the term idiot compassion when referring to a virtue being used in such a way that it's not only harmful to the other person, but it's harmful to you, but you think everything's awesome. You think it's great. You hospitality yourself into hunger. But I'm hospitable, right? That's idiot hospitality. Weaponized hospitality would mean that you give someone comfort and succor and food and everything else, and then a couple years later something comes up and you're like, yo man, look, I gave you a place to stay, I fed you, I did all these things, and now you're gonna be like, you're weaponizing that virtue, yeah? So each of the virtues has the ability, you're constantly trying to get to that apex virtue, but what's happening around you is that you're, yeah, like it's virtuing. It's not like you virtue. It's not like you're in a relationship. It's like you're relationshiping. It's a constantly moving thing. It's like balance. This idea of finding balance, it's baloney. Mm-hmm. You can't find balance. Balance is constantly moving. Ask any dancer, ask any boxer, martial artist, tightrope walker. Balance isn't a point that you stay at. It's a point that you pass through while you're looking for that thing. While you're looking for balance itself, you pass through it. Lots. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing in relationshiping, in any of these types of things, it's an active practice and it's constantly happening all at the same time. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
The strength of paganism is that we are in a living and flexible faith path. We can hold multiple truths at the same time. We are constantly reflecting and changing. We read sources, and when we find out new information, that information is we allow it to be part of our experience, and we constantly can change the way that we're moving through the world as we take in new data and learn new things. We're not stuck in a specific way of being or way of thinking, because we allow ourselves the freedom to have been wrong, to have found new sources of information. Anytime that there's an archaeological dig that brings us something new and we learn something new, we expand to include it. Right. We don't discount it and say, well, whatever excuse. We incorporate that into the way that we move forward from that point. Right. We allow new information to wash over us. And because of that, we have the ability to change the cultures that we interact with, our work cultures, our family cultures, our neighborhood cultures, by the way we move through the world with some of these consent culture practices built in. You know, our very way of life supports a culture of consent. You know, when you walk into a circle with people who are different from you, you know, oh, you're a Wiccan. That's awesome. Tell me more about that. Oh, you're a solitary. That's great. Oh, you're a humanist. That's awesome. And all of these things, even though they may be very different from me, who's a devotional polytheist, are true and right at the same time. And because we can hold that multiplicity of truths, and because we can't just assume what other people believe or feel is right for them, we have to ask. We have a built-in way of life that supports asking questions and gaining consent and working through those right relationships. You know, the mark of the kindred is left by our touch. So what mark are we leaving on the world? And I think that if this is the one, you know, getting people to learn how to ask questions, I think that would be a nice one for us to leave behind.
Yeah.
So that's everything that we have. Our contact information is on here. We also have a bibliography and an additional glossary of terms. We are like 1 minute away from time, which is awesome.
From time.
Yeah.
We made it. I am going to break in and say that we are 1 minute away from when I pretty shortly have to close this so that I can open another meeting so we can get back on our schedule. That does not mean, however, that you should not contact Missy and William with your questions. I will be sending out this slide deck, which includes this contact information, to everyone who is registered for this session. So please don't let this be the end of this conversation, even though pretty shortly it has to be the end of this instantiation of this conversation.
Missy and/or I will field all questions and get answers to y'all for all questions that come to us.